Egypt in the mid-13th century exists under constant pressure, a land balanced between desert and river, faith and steel. Armies pass along its roads with alarming regularity, bearing crosses or crescent banners, while courtiers measure survival by proximity to the throne. Rule is not abstract. It is embodied in men who command loyalty through lineage, force, and reputation. The state depends on their health, their heirs, their ability to maintain obedience. Beneath the outward permanence of fortresses and mosques lies a brittle reality. Succession disputes simmer quietly, and every illness, every absence, threatens to pull authority apart entirely inward. Egypt's rulers inherit more than land. They inherit unfinished wars and fragile alliances. The Ayyubid dynasty, forged through conquest and faith, governs a territory ringed by enemies and watched by rivals. Crusader states press from the coast. Mongol rumors drift from the east, and internal divisions gnaw at the court. Governance requires constant vigilance. Treasuries must be filled, soldiers paid, and legitimacy renewed through ceremony and piety. A sultan's authority is reinforced daily, or it erodes. Stability is never assumed. It must be performed, defended, and enforced, through visible strength and quiet compromise alike. Failure invites swift collapse without warning. Within this system, power follows bloodlines, and those outside them are rendered invisible. Women exist within the political sphere only as conduits, wives, mothers, or prizes exchanged between houses. Their influence is permitted indirectly, behind walls and curtains, never acknowledged publicly. Authority belongs to men, whose names are recited in khutbahs and stamped onto coins. Law and custom reinforce this exclusion, presenting it as natural and divinely ordered. To rule openly as a woman is unthinkable, not merely forbidden, but inconceivable. The structure itself resists the idea before any challenge can be voiced, within accepted social order norms firmly entrenched. Yet even rigid systems depend on continuity, and continuity depends on living bodies. A ruler's illness unsettles the entire court. Whispers spread through corridors, calculations are revised, and loyalties quietly reposition themselves. Succession is rarely settled in advance, and certainty is a luxury Egypt cannot afford. The machinery of state creaks under uncertainty, its gears turning more cautiously. In this environment, individuals who can manage information, control access, and maintain appearances gain disproportionate influence. Power begins to shift not through proclamation, but through proximity and necessity shaped by silence, routine, patience, and careful endurance amid constant risk everywhere daily present. The Ayyubid court is a place of ritualized restraint. Movement is measured, speech guarded, and emotion concealed behind etiquette. Decisions emerge slowly, wrapped in precedent and consultation, even as external threats demand speed. Military commanders balance obedience with ambition, knowing today's loyalty may be tomorrow's leverage. Administrators record revenues and grain supplies, fully aware that shortages can ignite rebellion. Every role is defined, every boundary enforced, yet stress fractures appear where pressure concentrates. The state holds together not because it is strong, but because collapse has not yet arrived, despite mounting strains, uncertainty, and relentless historical momentum pressing inward steadily. Religion reinforces order, while also narrowing acceptable action. Friday sermons affirm obedience to the ruler, linking political stability to divine favor. Law defines hierarchy as moral truth, discouraging deviation through both theology and tradition. Yet faith also demands justice, restraint, and stewardship, standards against which rulers are judged. Failure in these duties erodes legitimacy as surely as military defeat. Thus, authority exists in tension, bound to ideals it cannot fully satisfy. The Sultan must appear righteous, victorious, and in control, even when circumstances deny all three simultaneously across Egypt's courts, mosques, garrisons, cities, and borderlands, endlessly, visibly, publicly, daily, relentlessly. Against this backdrop, the exclusion of women is not merely social but structural. The political order is designed to pass over them entirely, rendering their labor essential yet unrecognized. They manage households, secure alliances through marriage, and absorb the risks of succession without reward. Their proximity to power is intimate, but officially irrelevant. This contradiction is rarely acknowledged, because acknowledging it would expose vulnerabilities the system cannot admit. The machinery of rule assumes silence, compliance, and invisibility from those it excludes most completely, maintaining stability through denial, habit, fear, tradition, repetition, and institutional momentum alone, long, sustained, unquestioned, unchallenged, enforced. Egypt, therefore, enters the mid-century tense and overextended, sustained by habit rather than confidence. Its rulers confront enemies without and fractures within, bound to traditions that limit adaptation. The political system functions, but only narrowly, relying on individuals to compensate for structural weakness. It is a world where survival depends on timing, discretion, and endurance. The ground beneath authority is already shifting, though few recognize it. What follows will not break Egypt suddenly. It will expose how close to breaking it has long been under accumulated pressure, silent compromise, deferred decisions, and concealed instability. Everywhere, constantly, quietly, persistently, endured. Shajar al-Durr enters the Ayyubid court without name or lineage that carries weight beyond the private chambers where she is kept. She is acquired, not introduced, her arrival recorded as property transferred rather than a presence acknowledged. The palace absorbs her as it does countless others whose lives sustain its rhythms without shaping its proclamations. Corridors echo with footsteps that are never hers to command. Doors open only at another's will, and every movement is conditioned by rank she cannot transcend. Yet proximity matters in such places, and even the powerless are shaped by what they are forced to witness. The household of the Sultan is a world apart from the public face of rule. Here, authority is softened by intimacy, but no less absolute. Decisions that will later be announced as decrees are first tested in private conversations, weighed in moments of fatigue, or shaped by unguarded remarks. Shajar al-Durr moves through these spaces in silence, attending, observing, remembering. She learns the cadence of the court not from instruction, but from repetition, from watching how servants anticipate moods and how favored figures linger while others are dismissed. Power reveals itself not as command alone, but as access. As a concubine, her value is defined by closeness to the ruler's body rather than his counsel. This position offers no security, only risk disguised as privilege. Favor can elevate, but it can also isolate. Attention invites resentment, and resentment travels quickly through a court built on competition. Shajar al-Durr understands early that survival depends on restraint. She speaks little, listens carefully, and cultivates an outward composure that reveals nothing. In doing so, she begins to understand that silence itself can be a form of control, withholding reaction in a space where every response is measured and remembered. The Sultan's household is crowded with men whose titles grant authority, but whose positions remain unstable. Military commanders arrive bearing news from distant fronts, administrators deliver reports on taxation and supply, scholars are consulted for legitimacy rather than counsel. Their conversations reveal tensions the public rituals conceal. Shajar al-Durr hears names repeated with caution, others spoken with disdain. She observes how alliances shift subtly, how favor is sought through proximity rather than argument. Over time, she begins to recognize patterns. Power does not flow evenly. It pools where necessity concentrates it. Her position brings her into repeated contact with the Sultan himself, a man weighed down by responsibility and illness in equal measure. In private moments, authority relaxes its posture. Fatigue replaces ceremony, and concerns surface that never reach the council chamber. Shajar al-Durr listens without interruption. She learns what keeps him awake, what he fears to lose, and which men he trusts when certainty dissolves. These moments do not grant her voice, but they grant her insight. She begins to understand that the state's strength is tethered precariously to a single body. Over time, the household adjusts to her presence. Servants learn her habits, guards recognize her passage, and rivals note her growing familiarity with the Sultan's routines. This familiarity alters the internal balance in ways difficult to quantify. Access becomes expectation. Messages pass through her, not because she demands it, but because it is efficient. She remembers details others forget, repeats instructions accurately, and maintains discretion when others boast. Gradually, she becomes useful. Usefulness, in a court defined by scarcity of trust, is its own form of influence. Shajar al-Durr's education is unstructured but thorough. She learns which officials speak truthfully and which flatter reflexively. She learns how delays are justified, how failures are reframed, and how success is claimed by those closest to authority. She notices that the loudest voices often conceal the least certainty. Over time, she develops an instinct for timing, understanding when silence preserves safety and when intervention prevents damage. This instinct is not taught. It is acquired through constant exposure to risk. Her status remains unchanged in name. She is still property, her fate legally bound to the will of others. Yet within the household, perception begins to shift. She is consulted informally, her opinion sought indirectly, her presence accepted in spaces once closed to her. This acceptance is fragile, dependent entirely on continued favor and discretion. She understands that any misstep could erase what she has gained. As a result, she cultivates restraint as carefully as others cultivate ambition. Survival remains her first concern, but awareness of possibility begins to grow. The court itself grows more unstable as pressures mount beyond its walls. Reports from the front arrive more frequently, bearing news of threats that require swift response. Resources are strained, alliances tested, and the margin for error narrows. In this environment, those who can manage continuity gain importance. Shajar al-Durr observes how the Sultan increasingly relies on routine, repeating trusted patterns to maintain control. She becomes part of that routine, a constant in an environment where certainty is rare. Her influence remains invisible to formal record, but it is felt in small adjustments: a meeting delayed, a message clarified, a command delivered at the right moment. These acts do not challenge authority, they preserve it. In preserving it, they quietly reshape the internal dynamics of power. Shajar al-Durr does not seek recognition for this role, knowing that visibility would invite resistance. Instead, she occupies the margins with precision, understanding that margins often bear the greatest structural load. By the time the court begins to sense deeper instability, Shajar al-Durr has already adapted to it. She understands that power is less a possession than a function, exercised by those who can act when others hesitate. Though she remains excluded from formal authority, her proximity to decision-making has altered her position irrevocably. The balance of the household has shifted, not through declaration, but through necessity. In a system strained by uncertainty, those who can maintain continuity become indispensable, even if the structure refuses to acknowledge them openly. The illness of Sultan al-Salih does not arrive as a single moment of crisis, but as a gradual narrowing of the court's confidence. At first, it is treated as inconvenience, a weakness to be managed through rest and delegation. Physicians are summoned quietly, their visits unannounced, their instructions followed with discretion. Curtains remain drawn longer than usual, audiences shortened or postponed. The machinery of rule continues to turn, but more slowly, and those responsible for maintaining its rhythm begin adjusting their steps. In a system so dependent on the physical presence of authority, even temporary absence creates unease. News of the Sultan's condition spreads, despite attempts at containment. Servants notice changes in routine. Guards observe delays. Officials are kept waiting without explanation. Whispers move faster than orders. The court becomes attentive to detail in ways that betray anxiety, reading meaning into gestures and silences. Each rumor carries potential consequence. Rivals assess opportunity. Allies reassess loyalty, and uncertainty begins to circulate through the palace like heat, invisible but oppressive. Authority still exists, but its projection weakens, and the cost of maintaining appearances rises steadily. Beyond the palace walls, Egypt's enemies remain active. Crusader forces along the coast require vigilance, their intentions uncertain but persistent. Military commanders request instructions that cannot be delayed indefinitely. Supplies must be allocated, garrisons reinforced, and alliances reassured. Each decision carries weight, and hesitation invites danger. The Sultan's illness transforms routine governance into a test of endurance. The state cannot pause while its ruler weakens. It must adapt, improvising continuity in the absence of visible command. Within the court, factions begin to position themselves quietly. Succession has not been firmly resolved, and ambiguity invites calculation. Men who once deferred now listen more closely, speak more carefully, and observe one another with renewed interest. Titles and offices retain their form, but their authority feels provisional. No one moves openly against the Sultan, yet preparation is evident in subtle shifts of behavior. Alliances tighten, messages multiply, and loyalty is measured not by words, but by readiness to act when direction falters. In this environment, discretion becomes essential. Decisions must be made without drawing attention to their source. Orders continue to bear the Sultan's name, even when issued by others acting in his stead. Secrecy is not merely protective, it is functional. Revealing weakness would invite fragmentation at a moment when cohesion is most needed. Thus, the court cultivates the appearance of stability through careful choreography, masking internal strain behind ritual and repetition. Shajar al-Durr finds her position transformed by necessity. Her proximity to the Sultan places her at the center of information flow, whether intended or not. She becomes aware of decisions before they are formalized, of concerns before they are voiced publicly. The Sultan relies increasingly on those who can manage continuity without demanding attention. In moments of fatigue or pain, he entrusts her with tasks that bypass formal channels, not as a grant of authority, but as a practical response to limitation. Each such moment draws her closer to the core of governance. The boundary between service and influence grows indistinct. Shajar al-Durr conveys instructions, clarifies intent, and ensures follow-through. Her actions are framed as assistance, yet their effect is unmistakable. She observes how quickly the court adapts to this arrangement, accepting it because it preserves order. Resistance would require acknowledgement of the problem, and acknowledgement carries risk. Thus, the system accommodates her role quietly, reshaping itself around necessity rather than principle. The Sultan's illness also alters his relationships. He becomes more guarded with those whose ambitions he questions, more reliant on those who offer stability without challenge. His confidence narrows to a small circle, within which Shajar al-Durr now resides. She listens as he considers threats not only from enemies, but from within his own court. These conversations reveal the fragility of his position more clearly than any decree could. Authority, she learns, is sustained as much by trust as by force, and trust is a scarce resource in times of uncertainty. As days pass, the strain on governance intensifies. Delays accumulate, and the margin for error shrinks. Military commanders press for clarity, administrators for authorization. Each request demands response, yet each response risks exposure. The court begins to operate on anticipation rather than instruction, acting preemptively to avoid paralysis. In doing so, it elevates those capable of judgment under pressure. Formal hierarchy gives way to functional necessity, even if only temporarily. External pressures compound internal anxiety. Reports arrive of enemy movements, of shifting alliances, of opportunities that may vanish if not seized. The court must respond without revealing the Sultan's condition. This requires coordination, speed, and discretion. Shajar al-Durr becomes instrumental in maintaining this balance, ensuring that information reaches the right hands without widening awareness unnecessarily. Her role expands not by declaration, but by repetition, each successful intervention reinforcing reliance upon her. The escalation is not marked by dramatic confrontation, but by accumulation. Each day the Sultan weakens, the court adjusts further, redistributing responsibility in small increments. No single decision defines this shift. Instead, it emerges as a pattern, visible only in retrospect. The state continues to function, yet it does so through improvisation rather than certainty. The line between acting on behalf of authority and exercising it grows increasingly blurred. Shajar al-Durr remains aware of the danger inherent in her position. Visibility invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites resistance. She continues to operate within the language of service, framing her actions as extensions of the Sultan's will. Yet she cannot ignore the reality that without her intervention, continuity would fracture. The court depends on her discretion as much as on any formal office. In this dependency lies both opportunity and peril. As the Sultan's condition deteriorates further, the illusion of stability becomes harder to sustain. The court stands exposed, its vulnerabilities no longer theoretical. Succession looms as an unresolved question. External threats remain unresolved, and authority rests on diminishing strength. The kingdom continues to function, but its foundations are visible now, strained and uneven. In this moment of exposure, roles shift according to necessity, not tradition. Those who can maintain order gain influence, even as the system denies their legitimacy. Egypt moves forward not through confidence, but through adaptation under pressure. Its future shaped by decisions made in shadow rather than ceremony. The death of Sultan al-Salih occurs without ceremony, without proclamation, without the rituals that normally transform a ruler's passing into a public event. It happens in a private chamber, attended by a small circle bound by necessity rather than protocol. The body that carried authority for years simply ceases to respond, leaving behind a silence heavy with implication. In that moment, Egypt becomes a kingdom without a king, though no one beyond those walls is permitted to know it. The danger is immediate and absolute. To reveal the truth would invite panic, division, and external attack. To conceal it requires discipline few institutions can sustain. Shajar al-Durr understands the stakes instinctively. There is no deliberation, no visible hesitation. Collapse would not arrive gradually. It would follow swiftly once uncertainty escaped containment. Succession is unresolved, enemies remain active, and the army stands poised between obedience and ambition. The machinery of the state cannot stop, not even briefly, without exposing its vulnerability. In the absence of acknowledged authority, legitimacy must be simulated through continuity. Shajar al-Durr chooses concealment not as deception for personal gain, but as the only means of survival for the state itself. The Sultan's death is kept secret. Physicians are dismissed quietly, servants sworn to silence, and access to the chamber restricted. The routines of the palace continue as if nothing has changed. Curtains are drawn as before, meals prepared, and guards maintain their posts. Orders continue to issue in the Sultan's name, carried by trusted intermediaries who ask no questions. Each command reinforces the illusion of presence. Authority persists because it appears to persist, and appearance, in this moment, is indistinguishable from reality. Shajar al-Durr assumes responsibility for maintaining this illusion. She coordinates communication between military commanders and administrators, ensuring that instructions align with existing strategy. Messages are crafted carefully, avoiding any indication of hesitation or transition. She relies on patterns established during the Sultan's illness, extending practices already familiar to the court. In doing so, she minimizes disruption. The state does not feel leaderless because it continues to behave as if leadership remains intact. The risk of exposure is constant. Every interaction carries the possibility of error, every delay an opportunity for suspicion. Shajar al-Durr manages these risks through restraint and precision. She limits the number of people aware of the truth, compartmentalizing knowledge to prevent leakage. Those who must know are chosen for reliability rather than rank. This inversion of hierarchy reflects the urgency of the moment. Trust becomes the currency of governance, replacing lineage and title as the basis of authority. Armies continue to move under orders that bear the Sultan's seal. Commanders comply because the commands make sense, align with their expectations, and arrive without contradiction. They have no reason to doubt their origin. War does not pause for succession, and hesitation could be fatal. By maintaining momentum, Shajar al-Durr prevents the military from becoming a source of instability. Action reassures, and reassurance delays inquiry. Within the palace, tension is palpable but contained. Courtiers sense that something is amiss, yet the absence of confirmation restrains them. To act prematurely would risk isolation or punishment. The discipline of silence holds because breaking it offers no immediate advantage. Shajar al-Durr leverages this uncertainty, allowing fear of the unknown to enforce compliance. The court remains functional not because it is confident, but because it is cautious. Authority in this period becomes performative rather than declarative. It exists in the execution of tasks, the continuation of routines, and the coherence of response. Shajar al-Durr does not claim the Sultan's role. She sustains its effects. Governance is reduced to its essentials: issuing orders, ensuring compliance, maintaining defense. Symbolism is set aside in favor of function. The throne is empty, but the state remains upright. This moment marks a profound transformation in how power operates. Titles and proclamations lose relevance, replaced by action and coordination. Shajar al-Durr exercises authority without recognition, her legitimacy derived solely from effectiveness. She understands that naming her role would undermine it. As long as the Sultan's death remains concealed, her actions can be framed as service rather than rule. The distinction is critical. Service invites acceptance, rule invites resistance. The secrecy cannot be maintained indefinitely, and Shajar al-Durr is aware of its limits. Each passing day increases the risk of discovery, yet time is necessary to prepare the ground for what must follow. Succession must be managed, alliances secured, and the transition shaped to avoid chaos. Concealment buys time, nothing more. But time is the most valuable resource available. In the interim, Egypt holds together through discipline and shared interest in survival. Those who participate in this silent governance do so with an understanding of its fragility. They recognize that the arrangement defies convention and cannot endure permanently. Yet they also see that without it, collapse would be immediate. Necessity overrides doctrine. The system adapts because it must, even as it resists acknowledging the adaptation. Shajar al-Durr bears the weight of this arrangement without ceremony or reward. She operates under constant threat, aware that discovery could result in swift punishment. Her resolve is sustained not by ambition, but by the recognition that failure would devastate the state she has come to understand intimately. She governs without title, commands without acknowledgement, and sustains authority through silence. In this brief interlude, Egypt exists in suspension, balanced between exposure and survival. The state functions because its actors choose continuity over truth, discipline over disclosure. Authority is no longer a name spoken aloud, but a series of acts performed daily. Shajar al-Durr's decision to conceal the Sultan's death becomes the fulcrum upon which the kingdom rests. It is a turning point not marked by declaration or conflict, but by quiet persistence. Egypt does not yet know it has crossed a threshold, but the nature of power within it has already changed. The illusion that sustains Egypt after the Sultan's death begins to strain under the weight of success. Military victories, achieved under orders issued in a dead man's name, demand acknowledgement. Messengers return with reports that require reward, explanation, and public affirmation of authority. Triumph, which should consolidate legitimacy, instead exposes its absence. The mechanisms that preserved stability through concealment now generate questions they cannot answer indefinitely. The state has survived the immediate danger, but survival brings visibility, and visibility demands a ruler who can be seen. The external threat that once justified secrecy no longer provides cover. With enemies repelled and borders secured, attention turns inward. Elites who tolerated ambiguity during crisis begin to seek clarity. Victories sharpen appetite rather than satisfy it, and the court's patience thins. Authority must now account for itself publicly. The continued issuance of orders without ceremony or audience becomes conspicuous. What was once discipline begins to resemble avoidance. The same success that preserved Egypt forces a reckoning with how it was achieved. Shajar al-Durr recognizes the shift before others articulate it. The rhythm of the court changes subtly. Conversations lengthen, pauses are weighted, and familiar routines invite scrutiny. The calculus that favored silence now threatens exposure. To continue concealment risks unraveling what has been held together. The illusion has reached its limit, not because it failed, but because it worked too well. Egypt requires a visible center of authority to absorb the consequences of victory. The decision to step into the open is not framed as ambition, but as resolution. Shajar al-Durr does not declare rebellion against tradition. She presents continuity against chaos. The announcement of her rule is prepared carefully, couched in language of necessity rather than challenge. It is justified by circumstance, by the absence of alternatives, and by the record of survival already achieved. The proclamation does not celebrate novelty. It explains inevitability. When the truth is revealed, it lands unevenly. Shock gives way to calculation. Egypt's elites confront a reality they did not anticipate and cannot easily reverse. A woman, formerly a slave, now occupies the seat of authority. The disclosure forces acknowledgement of what has already occurred. Orders have been obeyed, armies commanded, and enemies defeated under her coordination. To deny her legitimacy requires denying the coherence of recent events, a position few are willing to adopt openly. Resistance emerges not as immediate revolt, but as discomfort. Religious scholars question precedent, military leaders weigh loyalty against opportunity, and administrators measure stability against doctrine. None can ignore that Egypt stands intact. The state has not collapsed, it has functioned. This fact complicates every objection. Shajar al-Durr's rule is not hypothetical, it is demonstrable. She does not argue for her right to rule. She presents evidence of having ruled already. Her public appearance alters the symbolic order of the court. Rituals are adjusted, proclamations reformulated, and ceremonies improvised to accommodate an unprecedented reality. Each adaptation exposes the system's flexibility under pressure. The very institutions that exclude women now scramble to define their authority under her presence. This tension does not resolve quickly. It settles into a fragile equilibrium, sustained by shared reluctance to disrupt what currently works. Shajar al-Durr governs with caution, aware that visibility magnifies risk. She avoids excess, presenting herself as custodian rather than innovator. Her actions emphasize continuity with established policy, reinforcing the sense that her rule is an extension of necessity rather than rupture. This restraint is deliberate. She understands that overt assertion would harden opposition. Instead, she relies on the inertia of success and the exhaustion of conflict to maintain acceptance. The elite's response reflects their divided priorities. Some see opportunity in alignment, others threat in precedent. Yet none can ignore the immediate need for coherence. Egypt's survival depends on unified command, and fragmentation would invite renewed danger. Shajar al-Durr exploits this logic without stating it. Her authority rests on the argument that removing her would destabilize the state more than accepting her presence. It is a negative legitimacy, built on avoidance of worse outcomes. As her rule becomes public, the language of governance shifts. Orders are no longer issued under borrowed names. Decrees bear her authority directly, forcing acknowledgement of her position. This transparency alters the stakes. Obedience becomes a conscious choice rather than habitual response. Each act of compliance reinforces her legitimacy incrementally. Each day without rebellion normalizes what once seemed impossible. The transition is not smooth. Murmurs of dissent persist, and alliances remain provisional. Shajar al-Durr navigates these tensions through careful distribution of favor and responsibility. She rewards loyalty without overcommitting, balances factions without empowering rivals excessively. Her governance reflects the lessons learned in silence: discretion, timing, and adaptability. She governs as someone aware of how easily authority can fracture. Her ascent exposes the gap between doctrine and practice. Religious objections coexist with pragmatic acceptance. Scholars debate, but soldiers follow orders. Administrators process decrees, and taxes are collected. Life continues. The state functions. This dissonance weakens resistance by dispersing it across competing priorities. No single institution can move decisively without risking isolation. The proclamation of her rule marks a resolution, not because conflict ends, but because uncertainty changes form. The question is no longer who governs, but how long this arrangement can endure. Shajar al-Durr has crossed from invisibility to exposure, exchanging secrecy for scrutiny. The act is irreversible. Whatever follows will occur in public view. In stepping into the open, Shajar al-Durr transforms the crisis of succession into a test of endurance. Her rule is not celebrated, nor is it universally accepted. It is tolerated because it answers immediate needs. Egypt's elites confront the limits of their own assumptions, forced to reconcile tradition with survival. The moment power becomes public is not triumphant. It is tense, measured, and incomplete. This chapter closes not with resolution of legitimacy, but with its redefinition. Authority has been exercised, acknowledged, and contested within a compressed span of time. The state has adapted under pressure, revealing both resilience and fragility. Shajar al-Durr stands at the center of this adaptation, her position secured not by proclamation alone, but by the absence of viable alternatives. Egypt moves forward under a ruler it did not plan for, confronting a future shaped by necessity rather than consensus. Shajar al-Durr's accession to the throne resolves the immediate crisis of authority, but inaugurates a more complex struggle over legitimacy. Egypt now has a ruler whose competence is evident and whose position remains contested. The state continues to function, yet every institution measures her presence against norms it was never designed to accommodate. The throne exists, but it does so in tension, supported by necessity rather than consensus. Governance becomes an exercise in balance, maintaining cohesion while absorbing resistance that cannot be eliminated outright. Religious scholars are among the first to articulate discomfort. Their objections are framed in jurisprudence and precedent, questioning the permissibility of female rule within established doctrine. These arguments are not uniformly aggressive, but they circulate persistently, shaping opinion without provoking immediate confrontation. Shajar al-Durr responds not through debate, but through restraint. She avoids public theological conflict, understanding that legitimacy grounded in argument invites counterargument. Instead, she allows scholars to speak while ensuring that governance proceeds uninterrupted. Their dissent remains abstract as long as the state remains stable. The military presents a different challenge. Commanders respect effectiveness and continuity, yet they are acutely aware of the opportunities instability presents. Loyalty in such an environment is conditional, reinforced by reward and vigilance rather than principle. Shajar al-Durr maintains the chain of command carefully, confirming appointments, honoring past commitments, and avoiding abrupt changes that might provoke uncertainty. She recognizes that the army's obedience is pragmatic, tied to pay, prestige, and success. As long as these are maintained, resistance remains latent rather than active. Rival dynasties observe Egypt closely, weighing intervention against risk. Shajar al-Durr's rule complicates their calculations. Her lack of traditional legitimacy suggests vulnerability, yet Egypt's recent resilience deters immediate aggression. External actors test boundaries through diplomacy rather than invasion, probing for weakness without committing force. Shajar al-Durr responds with caution, preserving alliances where possible and avoiding provocations. She presents Egypt as unified and resolute, aware that perception abroad influences stability at home. Within the court, adaptation continues unevenly. Some officials align themselves openly with the new order, recognizing opportunity in loyalty. Others comply reluctantly, maintaining distance while fulfilling obligations. Shajar al-Durr navigates these dynamics through careful distribution of authority. She avoids concentrating power excessively, preferring to balance factions against one another. This approach limits any single group's capacity to challenge her directly, but it also prevents the emergence of unambiguous support. Stability is achieved through dispersion rather than consolidation. Her public role requires constant calibration. Ceremony and symbolism, once avoided, become unavoidable. Coins are minted, proclamations issued, and rituals performed, each one reinforcing her authority while inviting scrutiny. Shajar al-Durr approaches these moments with deliberate moderation. She does not exaggerate her presence or seek to redefine tradition overtly. Instead, she adapts existing forms to accommodate her rule, minimizing rupture. This incremental approach reduces immediate backlash but leaves underlying tensions unresolved. The throne's instability is felt most acutely in moments of decision. Each choice is weighed not only for its practical consequences, but for its symbolic implications. A command interpreted as assertive risks provoking opposition. One perceived as cautious risks undermining authority. Shajar al-Durr governs within this narrow corridor, relying on judgment honed during years of informal influence. She understands that legitimacy, once questioned, cannot be asserted forcefully without consequence. It must be demonstrated repeatedly through effective governance. Her personal position remains precarious. Unlike male rulers who inherit legitimacy through lineage, she must reaffirm hers through performance. There is no reservoir of assumed authority to draw upon. Each success strengthens her position incrementally. Each failure would be magnified disproportionately. This asymmetry shapes her rule, encouraging prudence over ambition. She governs not as a conqueror, but as a stabilizer, preserving what exists rather than reshaping it dramatically. The court's resistance is often passive rather than confrontational. Delays, formal objections, and procedural challenges accumulate, slowing initiatives without halting them. Shajar al-Durr counters this through persistence, returning repeatedly to unresolved matters until compliance is secured. She does not seek to expose resistance publicly, preferring to neutralize it quietly. This method avoids escalation, but demands constant attention. Governance becomes labor-intensive, dependent on her continued involvement. Despite these challenges, Egypt remains intact. Trade continues, taxes are collected, and borders are defended. Daily life proceeds, lending her rule a sense of normalcy that gradually tempers opposition. The absence of crisis undermines arguments against her authority more effectively than any decree could. Stability becomes its own justification, even as critics persist. The state's endurance complicates the narrative of illegitimacy, forcing detractors to reconcile doctrine with reality. Shajar al-Durr's reign exposes the difference between theoretical order and lived governance. Institutions designed to exclude women now function under her direction, revealing their adaptability under pressure. This adaptability is not celebrated, it is concealed, framed as exception rather than precedent. Yet its existence cannot be denied. The system bends to accommodate what it cannot formally endorse, preserving itself through contradiction. Her authority remains conditional, dependent on continued success and absence of viable alternatives. This dependency shapes every interaction, infusing governance with caution. Shajar al-Durr understands that her rule is tolerated rather than embraced. She does not mistake endurance for acceptance. The throne beneath her remains unstable, its supports provisional and contested. In this phase, resolution is partial. The immediate crisis of succession has been addressed, and Egypt functions under a recognized ruler. Yet the question of legitimacy persists, unresolved and persistent. Shajar al-Durr occupies the throne without precedent, her position secured by necessity and sustained through competence. The state depends on her, even as it resists her, locked in a balance that cannot endure indefinitely. This chapter closes with Egypt stabilized but unsettled. Authority exists, exercised daily and acknowledged formally, yet it lacks deep roots. Shajar al-Durr governs a state that functions despite its discomfort, not because it has resolved it. The throne stands, but it stands on ground that shifts beneath it, held together by vigilance, restraint, and the fragile logic of survival. The end of Shajar al-Durr's rule arrives not as a prolonged struggle, but as a sudden release of pressures that had been accumulating quietly beneath the surface. The same forces that tolerated her authority out of necessity now move decisively once alternatives emerge. Legitimacy, never fully granted, is withdrawn with speed. Alliances shift with little warning, and the restraint that once preserved stability gives way to violence. The transition is abrupt, leaving little room for negotiation or retreat. Power, which had rested uneasily on competence alone, is reclaimed through force. Her removal is not framed as correction of injustice, but as restoration of order. Those who act against her do so under the language of tradition and propriety, presenting violence as necessity rather than ambition. The court that once adapted to her presence now asserts its boundaries, eager to erase the exception she represented. Shajar al-Durr is isolated quickly, deprived of the networks that sustained her rule. The same discretion that protected her becomes a liability, offering few public allies willing to challenge the outcome openly. The violence itself is stark and personal. It is not the distant abstraction of battle, but an act carried out within confined spaces, charged with symbolism and finality. Her death serves as both punishment and message, signaling the limits of deviation the system will tolerate. The brutality is deliberate, intended to close the chapter decisively. There is no attempt to mitigate its meaning. The state reasserts itself through physical dominance, reclaiming authority in the most unambiguous form available. Power passes on swiftly, minimizing uncertainty. A new ruler is elevated, one whose legitimacy conforms more closely to established norms. Rituals resume their familiar patterns, and proclamations emphasize continuity. The machinery of governance absorbs the transition with practiced efficiency. What had been fragile stabilizes quickly, suggesting that the system had prepared for this moment, even as it postponed it. The speed of normalization underscores how provisional Shajar al-Durr's position had always been. Yet the restoration is incomplete in ways not immediately acknowledged. The system that replaces her quietly incorporates lessons learned during her rule. The mechanisms of authority have been exposed, and they cannot be unseen. Decisions once monopolized by lineage are now recognized as functions that can be performed by those with access and competence. While the symbolic order is restored, the practical understanding of power has shifted subtly. The state has learned how to operate without strict adherence to its own declared principles. Official narratives move quickly to reduce Shajar al-Durr's reign. Chroniclers minimize its duration, emphasize irregularity, and frame her authority as aberration rather than adaptation. Her achievements are attributed to others, or described as extensions of male authority. The language of record seeks to contain her impact by narrowing its scope. Silence becomes a tool of restoration, erasing complexity in favor of reassurance. What cannot be denied is reframed as anomaly, safely confined to the margins of history. This reduction serves an institutional purpose. To acknowledge her rule fully would require confronting the flexibility of norms long presented as immutable. It would expose the degree to which necessity can override doctrine, a recognition that threatens the legitimacy of future rulers as much as past ones. By diminishing her presence in official memory, the system protects itself from uncomfortable precedent. The act of forgetting becomes a form of governance. Despite this effort, the consequences of her reign persist. Those who served during her rule carry forward an altered understanding of authority. They have seen governance function under unconventional conditions, and that experience informs their behavior. Decision-making becomes more pragmatic, less bound to ritual alone. While the symbolic order remains intact, the internal calculus of power has changed. The system now contains knowledge it did not possess before, even if it refuses to articulate it openly. Shajar al-Durr's removal also reinforces the boundaries of acceptable rule through example. Her fate serves as warning to others who might challenge convention too directly. The system demonstrates both its capacity to adapt and its willingness to punish adaptation once the crisis has passed. This duality becomes part of the political landscape, shaping behavior through implicit threat rather than explicit law. Authority is flexible under pressure, but unforgiving once stability returns. The violence that ends her life resolves immediate tensions, but leaves deeper contradictions unresolved. The state reasserts male rule, yet it cannot fully erase the memory of female authority exercised effectively. The contradiction remains embedded within institutional practice, resurfacing in moments of crisis when necessity again demands deviation. Shajar al-Durr's reign becomes a suppressed reference point, invoked silently when convention fails. Her personal story fades quickly from public discourse. There are no monuments, no sustained commemorations. The court moves on, eager to project continuity and control. Yet, absence itself becomes meaningful. The lack of acknowledgement contrasts sharply with the scale of her impact during crisis. Silence fills the space where explanation might have been, leaving later generations to reconstruct her significance from fragments. This historical silence is not accidental. It reflects deliberate choices about what is remembered and what is allowed to disappear. By controlling narrative, the state shapes understanding of legitimacy and possibility. Shajar al-Durr's reduction to footnote reinforces the idea that her rule was an interruption rather than a revelation. Yet the very need to reduce her indicates how disruptive her presence was to established order. Power, once reclaimed, settles into familiar channels. The state resumes its rhythms, outwardly unchanged. However, beneath the surface, governance carries traces of her influence. Procedures refined during crisis persist, adapted quietly into routine. The system that removed her cannot fully discard what it learned from her. In this way, her legacy survives not in name, but in practice. The synthesis of her fall lies in this contradiction. Shajar al-Durr is removed violently, her authority denied, her memory constrained. Yet the political order that replaces her is altered by the experience of her rule. The system absorbs her impact while rejecting her legitimacy, preserving stability at the cost of honesty. Her reign becomes both denied and foundational, erased and formative. This chapter closes not with redemption or recognition, but with containment. Violence resolves the immediate challenge, and silence manages the aftermath. Egypt's political order reasserts itself, outwardly intact, inwardly changed. Shajar al-Durr's life ends abruptly, but the questions her rule exposed remain embedded within the structures of power. History records her briefly, then moves on, carrying forward lessons it refuses to name. Shajar al-Durr's legacy does not reside comfortably within the categories history prefers. She is neither founder nor conqueror, neither saint nor usurper. Her rule was brief, contested, and deliberately diminished by those who followed her. Yet its significance lies precisely in what it revealed, rather than what it established. In a moment of extreme pressure, when the formal structures of authority failed to function as designed, she demonstrated how power actually operated beneath titles and doctrine. Her ascent stripped governance to its essentials, exposing a system sustained less by legitimacy than by coordination, access, and decisive action. What her reign made visible was not an alternative political order, but the contingency of the existing one. Authority in Egypt had long been presented as fixed, rooted in lineage, gender, and divine sanction. Shajar al-Durr's rule showed that these elements mattered most when stability allowed them to matter. Under crisis, they receded, replaced by practical necessity. Decisions still had to be made, armies still moved, and resources still allocated. Those functions did not require ritual so much as proximity and competence. Her success forced an uncomfortable recognition that the state could survive, even function effectively, outside the boundaries it publicly defended. This recognition posed a threat beyond her individual rule. If authority could be exercised without fulfilling its symbolic prerequisites, then those prerequisites were revealed as tools rather than truths. The system depended on their perception, not their inevitability. Shajar al-Durr did not articulate this challenge openly. but her actions embodied it. Her governance operated as proof rather than argument, making it more difficult to refute without confronting the evidence of survival and success. The response to this threat was not reform, but erasure. By reducing her reign to an anomaly, chroniclers and officials sought to reassert the permanence of established norms. Silence became a corrective, narrowing her presence in memory until it could be contained safely. This process did not merely forget her. It repurposed her story as warning rather than precedent. The brutality of her removal reinforced this lesson, demonstrating the cost of transgression once necessity had passed. The system reasserted its boundaries forcefully, reminding future actors that adaptation would be tolerated only temporarily. Yet erasure has limits. While names can be minimized and records shaped, experience cannot be undone. Those who governed during her reign carried forward a changed understanding of how authority functions under strain. They had witnessed the effectiveness of informal power, the importance of information control, and the fragility of symbolic legitimacy. These insights did not vanish with her death. They were absorbed quietly into administrative practice, altering behavior without altering language. The state learned from her even as it denied her. This quiet absorption is central to her legacy. Shajar al-Durr did not leave institutions bearing her name, but she left procedures shaped by crisis management rather than tradition alone. The court that followed her was more attuned to the mechanics of continuity, more aware of how quickly authority could unravel. While public narratives returned to familiar forms, internal governance reflected a memory of improvisation. The system had been tested and survived, and that survival changed its internal calculus permanently. Her story also complicates simplistic readings of historical progress. Shajar al-Durr's rule did not usher in greater inclusion or structural change. Women were not admitted into formal power as a result of her reign. On the contrary, her fate reinforced exclusion by demonstrating its enforcement. Yet this outcome does not negate the significance of her rule. Instead, it underscores the tension between what systems claim to be and what they must become under pressure. Her legacy lies in that tension, unresolved and persistent. As an individual, Shajar al-Durr resists easy interpretation. She is often framed as exceptional, an outlier whose uniqueness explains her ascent. This framing serves to isolate her impact, suggesting that her rule was possible only because of personal qualities unlikely to recur. Such interpretations deflect attention from the conditions that enabled her rise. It was not singular brilliance alone, but systemic vulnerability, unresolved succession, and external threat that created space for her authority. By focusing on her as anomaly, history obscures the structural realities she revealed. Her erasure from official memory reflects anxiety rather than confidence. Systems that are secure do not fear acknowledgement of deviation. The effort to minimize her suggests awareness that her rule exposed something fundamental. That exposure could not be undone without confronting uncomfortable truths about legitimacy and power. Silence offered a safer alternative, allowing the system to move forward without reckoning openly with what had been learned. In this sense, Shajar al-Durr occupies a paradoxical position. She is both marginal and central, briefly acknowledged and deeply influential. Her name appears fleetingly in chronicles, yet her impact is woven into the evolution of governance. The contradiction mirrors the one she embodied during her life: indispensable, yet unacceptable; effective, yet illegitimate. History's treatment of her reflects the same logic that governed her reign, valuing function while denying recognition. The phrase "impossible ruler" captures this tension accurately. Shajar al-Durr was impossible not because she failed, but because her success could not be reconciled with prevailing norms. Her rule forced a confrontation between ideology and reality prevailed only temporarily. Once stability returned, ideology reasserted itself with force. The impossibility lay not in her capacity to govern, but in the system's willingness to accept what her governance implied. Egypt was not transformed visibly by her reign, yet it was altered subtly and enduringly. The political order that followed her carried forward an awareness of its own flexibility and fragility. While this awareness remained unspoken, it shaped responses to later crises. The memory of how power had been exercised without formal legitimacy lingered as a reference point, informing decisions even as it was denied publicly. Shajar al-Durr's historical verdict is therefore complex and restrained. She neither shattered the system, nor was she fully erased by it. Instead, she revealed its mechanics, endured its correction, and left behind an altered understanding of authority that persisted beneath restored forms. Her life demonstrates how history often advances not through permanent change, but through moments of exposure that cannot be entirely concealed afterward. History remembers her briefly because it does not know where to place her comfortably. Yet Egypt was never the same because it could not unlearn what her rule had shown. In moments of crisis, when tradition falters and necessity returns, the shadow of her reign lingers. It is not invoked by name, but by function, reminding the state of what it can become when survival demands it. That is her enduring legacy, not a model to be repeated, but a truth revealed and quietly carried forward.